All right, welcome to week 8 of Leadership and Administration. It's really good to be with you, and we're going to talk today about leadership and developing leadership diversity. Very important in Canada in the 21st century. So some of the learning objectives we want you to really drill down on this week and think about as you're reading your material, as you're going through some of the other video clips and the discussion, are these learning objectives. And the first is we want you to understand how to reduce the difficulties faced by minorities in organizations. And minorities face tremendous challenges in organizations within Canada in the 21st century. The research bears that out, and you'll do some reading about that. Secondarily, we want you to apply an awareness of the dimensions of diversity and multicultural issues in your everyday life. And then lastly, from this slide, we want you to encourage and support diversity to meet organizational needs. We live in a very diverse country. Canada, as you know, is very multicultural. Some research was done on the impact even of accents, and it was shown that when people put their applications in on paper, everything is equal, but then when they go in for the interview, the research shows that there is prejudice based upon their accents if they're not Canadian. And so we realize that diversity, though, is very, very important to organizational strength. We talked about this last week when we looked at teams and the importance of diversity to teams. Diversity is a great venue for learning, but diversity also brings tremendous strength because we look at the world in different ways depending on our national culture and our familial culture and our education and our personalities. And those differences then leveraged can really help us to become agile and function well as an organization. And so diversity is very important. And for you as a leader, you want to be intentionally designing diversity into your organization to leverage that strength. You don't want to fear diversity. You want to embrace it, become inclusive, and build a diverse workforce and a diverse team. But as we think about then building this diverse team, one of the things you want to think about is this idea of cultural values and their role in determining how to deal with employees from different cultures. And one of the things I'd encourage you to get, and it's free, is Hofstede's Culture. It used to be called Culture GPS. I think it's now called Culture Map. And you can get that on iTunes and on Google Play. And you can also go online and do a culture comparison. And Hofstede did a study of 110,000 IBM employees worldwide. And he came up with the 5 dimensions of culture. He now has a 6th dimension, such as power distance index, masculinity, long-term avoidance, uncertainty. And different cultures then score high or low on these different indices that he developed. And so if you were to plug in Canada and China, you'd see there's a great difference between these two countries, for instance, in the area of power distance index. China has a very high power distance index. There's a great separation between followers and leaders within China. It's a very authoritarian view of leadership. Whereas Canada has a low power distance index and is very egalitarian. So how you as a leader then, as you bring people from those two cultures into your organization with an awareness of how they view leadership becomes very important in how you lead them. Second thing we want to look at is what personal barriers stand in your way as a leader in terms of becoming inclusive and being able to identify those and work through them. And one of the key ways we do that is that we see people as people. People are not a means to an end. People are the end. People are valuable because of their personhood. As I mentioned, in North America, we say cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. But in Africa, we say ubuntu, I am because you are. I am a person by virtue of other persons. And so when you hurt, I hurt. When you win, I win. And when we have that mindset, it becomes very much easier to embrace diversity because your personhood enriches my personhood and vice versa. That's the Ubuntu way of looking at life. And of course, that's a cultural heritage. And then this other area that as leaders we need to be very aware of is the capacity to use sponsorship and employee affinity groups to support female and minority participation. Sponsorship is very important because women leaders have to navigate what Northhouse 2018 terms the leadership labyrinth. We have tended to talk about the glass ceiling, which is the idea that women can get to a certain point and then can't break through that leadership ceiling. What Northhouse and his colleagues' research shows is that women have to first navigate a leadership labyrinth in terms of education, in terms of gender, and in terms of then also home responsibilities. And those are then broken down into subcategories. These are all things that women leaders have to navigate before they even get to the glass ceiling, which they then have to break through. So sponsorship becomes a very powerful vehicle and mechanism to help women leaders effectively navigate that labyrinth. Sponsorship and mentorship and minority groups. So what is diversity? Diversity, general definition is that it is differences. Diversity equals difference. How are you different to me? That makes us diverse. Differences among people in terms of age, and we know that we have these age groupings of builder, boomer, buster, Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z, and each of those age groupings, in a sense, has a certain way of viewing the world, whether they're digital outcasts, digital immigrants, digital natives. Just one example of the ways that age categorization can create difference. Differences in gender, differences in race, and some other dimensions that we'll look at in a few slides forward in a moment here. So when we think about diversity in general, this definition of diversity in general, we then drill down on it to workforce diversity. And this speaks to a workforce that's made up of people with different human qualities. And that's the organization you want to build. A workforce that has different human qualities, different personalities, different ways of viewing the world, different qualifications. Very, very important. People who belong to different cultural groups and have different human qualities. So our traditional view of gender, of diversity, ties to gender, race, age, pay level, disability, and lifestyle. This is how we used to traditionally view diversity. Now we move not just to talk about diversity, but actually inclusivity in leadership. And that's where we see so many other areas that we need to think about. How do we build an inclusive workplace that takes account of all of these variables and they all feel comfortable and they all feel well positioned within the workplace that we are leading? For instance, if someone is a parent, do they feel comfortable functioning as a parent? We know that recently there was a member of parliament who for the first time was able to breastfeed her child during parliamentary proceedings. And it was a little bit radical at first, but great inclusive step to say you're not going to be excluded from these proceedings just because you're a new mom. Language, very, very important. Yesterday I did a podcast with one of our consultants from Brazil. And she struggled as she was communicating. She has a doctorate in education and organizational leadership. And it was just really interesting to me as she spoke about digital leadership, how we had to really work on this issue of language. And so I think whilst we're going to certainly use her podcast in English, I then shot her a text later on and said, would you be willing to do your podcast in Portuguese, your native tongue from Brazil? And she got very, very excited about that. So as leaders, just thinking about how can we help you to feel valued for who you are and for the things that you possess. And it is very valuable. And you can look at each of those as we progress. So what are some of the factors that are contributing to increased acceptance of diversity in our world today? Well, first of all, the demographic changes. You know, Canada used to be somewhat homogenous and had kind of set cultural mores. And of course, we know that Canada today is very multicultural, very diverse. And so that forces us to think about how do we intentionally embrace that and leverage that in our organizations. We also know that there's shifting social values. People are much more open to diversity and to inclusion and to seeing people as people. And then this notion of globalization. Not only are we going out into the world is coming to us, and in a sense, it's a much smaller world. We're much more connected, and so we're very aware of these different national cultures globally and how they're functioning. All right, last few things we want to talk about. Why is diversity important or valuable to an organization? For you as a leader, you want to intentionally embrace diversity and be inclusive in your leadership approach. Firstly, because it's the right thing to do. People are people, and people have value by virtue of the fact that they're people. But it also then will strengthen your organization if you're intentionally embracing and building diversity. So the first is, we know diversity of thought aids in achieving high performance. When you have people that are able to look at a problem from different angles and problem solve that from different angles, we know that that really helps in achieving high performance as people then come with different perspectives and help us think in different ways. Diversity is important because it gives us a broader and deeper base of ideas, opinions, and experiences. And that's so important. In a globalized world with globalized problems, we need globalized people who can help us think those through in their frame of reference, and it gives us an edge. We know that diversity brings increased creativity and innovation. As we begin to look at the problem from our vantage point, look at the challenge from our vantage point, but then hear the vantage points of others, and we begin to then brainstorm together, or as I like to say, brainwrite together, we then come up with innovative ways of moving forward and iterating changes. Diversity brings financial competitiveness because of these different areas that we're now able to invoke. It really improves our bottom line. And I like this one. It helps us meet the needs of diverse customers. Going back to our Brazilian consultant, we're offering a university certificate in police leadership to universities in Brazil. And that's tremendously helpful to them. But I'm not the one who's going to be facilitating that certificate, even though I developed it. Our Brazilian consultant is going to be the one who does that because she understands their culture and she speaks their language. Vitally important that you become a leader who intentionally develops diversity and embraces an inclusive mindset in your workplace. Thank you so much.